It's 78 years old. After spending more than 3 decades on death row, one man slowly walked into the execution chamber in Texas. His body was weak, his hair had turned completely gray, and his health was failing. But none of that stopped the state from carrying out the sentence that had been hanging over him for 32 years. That man was Wayne Buntion. When the lethal injection finally took his life on April 21, 2022, he became the oldest person ever executed in Texas history. But here's the thing that still sparks debate today. By the time he was executed, Buntion was elderly, sick, and had spent decades behind bars without causing trouble. Even a U.S. Supreme Court justice questioned whether executing someone after such a long time was constitutional. So the big question is, was justice finally served, or did the system take things too far? To understand why this case became so controversial, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. And trust me, Bunton's story started in chaos. But before we dive deeper, quick favor. If you enjoy true crime stories that uncover the darker side of history, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. Because honestly, it takes hours to research stories like this. And if you keep watching without subscribing, YouTube might think you hate this channel, and that would be tragic. Now, let's get back to the story. Long before he ever stepped inside a courtroom, Buntion grew up in an environment that many people would describe as deeply unstable. He was born in 1944 into a household filled with violence. According to testimony later revealed in court, his father was an extremely dangerous man. At one point, his father reportedly killed a man in front of one of his own children, and the violence didn't stop there. Family members later described brutal abuse happening regularly inside the home. In one particularly disturbing incident, Bunton's father allegedly smashed his wife's teeth during an attack. The children weren't spared either. Broken bones, beatings, and constant fear were reportedly part of daily life. Bunton later claimed that growing up in that environment left him with severe psychological trauma. He said the abuse haunted him for the rest of his life. But childhood trauma alone doesn't determine someone's future, and as Bunton got older, his life began taking a much darker path. Because by the early 1960s, he had already started building a criminal record, and it would only get worse from there. The first official mark on Bunton's criminal record came in 1961. It was a theft conviction, but that was just the beginning. Over the next several years, the charges continued piling up. Burglary, property damage, drug possession. One arrest after another began forming a long rap sheet. Eventually, Bunton ended up serving time in prison, but the most disturbing conviction involved the assault of a child. For that crime, he received a 15-year prison sentence. However, he didn't serve the full term. After about 13 months, he was released on parole, and that decision would later become one of the most controversial parts of this entire story, because not long after his release, tragedy struck his family. His twin brother, Kenneth Bunton, became involved in a violent confrontation with police. During a shootout, Kenneth was killed. According to reports that later surfaced, Bunton was furious. Some people claimed he even vowed revenge against law enforcement. One witness reportedly said Bunton made a chilling statement. He allegedly said he would rather shoot it out with police than ever go back to prison again. Whether that statement was real or exaggerated remains debated, but what happened next would make headlines across Texas, because just a few months later, a routine traffic stop turned deadly. On June 27, 1990, a Houston police officer named James Irby was performing a routine patrol. He pulled over a car. Inside the vehicle were 2 men. One of them was Wayne Buntion. Officer Irby approached the driver and began speaking with him. At first, everything appeared normal. Then suddenly, Bunton stepped out of the passenger side. Without warning, he pulled out a gun and fired. The bullet struck Officer Irby in the head. The officer collapsed immediately. But the attack didn't stop there. As Irby fell to the ground, Buntion fired 2 more shots into his back. Within seconds, the situation had turned from a routine traffic stop into a shocking murder. But Buntion wasn't done. Witnesses later said he began firing at people nearby. He attempted to hijack another vehicle. He even fired at another police officer who tried to respond. For several terrifying minutes, the area turned into complete chaos. Eventually, Buntion ran into a nearby building and tried to hide, but police quickly surrounded the area, and soon after, he was arrested. The trial that followed seemed straightforward, but what no one expected was how long the legal battle would last, because this case would stretch across 3 decades.
In 1991, Buntion went to trial. The jury found him guilty of capital murder, and the sentence was clear: death. For many people, that would have been the end of the story, but the legal system rarely moves quickly in death penalty cases. Years passed, then decades. In 2009, nearly 20 years after the original trial, something surprising happened. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned Buntion's death sentence. Not the conviction, just the sentence. That meant a new sentencing trial had to take place. So in 2012, another jury heard the case again, and once again, they decided Buntion should be executed. But the appeals still weren't finished. The case eventually reached the Supreme Court of the United States. In 2021, the Supreme Court declined to hear his appeal, but one justice made an unusual statement. Justice Stephen Breyer questioned whether executing someone after spending decades on death row was even constitutional. He pointed out that the extremely long delays in death penalty cases raise serious concerns. Still, the execution date remained, and by this time, Buntion was no longer the same man who committed the crime in 1990. He was now elderly and very sick. By the early 2020s, Buntion was nearly 80 years old. His health had deteriorated significantly. He suffered from multiple chronic conditions: vertigo, arthritis, severe sciatic nerve pain. Sometimes he even needed a wheelchair to move around. His lawyers argued that executing someone in that condition served no purpose. They said he had behaved peacefully in prison for years, and they claimed he was no longer a threat to anyone. So they asked for clemency, either reduce his sentence or delay the execution. But the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles reviewed the request, and their decision was unanimous. They rejected it. The execution would move forward. But what happened just days before the scheduled execution added another strange twist to the story. About a week before the execution, Buntion suddenly became seriously ill. He was diagnosed with pneumonia. Doctors had to take him to a hospital for treatment. Some supporters argued that executing someone who was sick like that was cruel, but the execution date didn't change. Then something else happened. While being transported back to prison, the vehicle carrying Buntion reportedly stopped suddenly. He hit his head during the incident. Yet again, lawyers tried to push for a delay, but the courts refused. The execution would happen as planned. And on April 21, 2022, the final chapter arrived. The execution took place at the Huntsville unit. Inside the chamber, Buntion was strapped to a gurney. Witnesses waited quietly. Before the lethal injection began, he delivered his final statement. He expressed remorse for the killing of Officer Irby. He said he hoped the victim's family could finally find closure. Then the injection began. The drug used was pentobarbital. Within minutes, Buntion lost consciousness. At 6:39 p.m., he was pronounced dead. But outside the prison, something unusual was happening. Dozens of motorcyclists had gathered near the facility. Many of them were law enforcement officers or supporters. At the moment of the execution, they revved their engines loudly. The roar of the motorcycles echoed across the prison grounds. Some witnesses said the sound could even be heard inside the building. Not everyone agreed with the display. Some people called it disrespectful. Others saw it as a tribute to the fallen officer.
But the most emotional reaction came from the person who had waited the longest, Officer Irby's widow. For more than 30 years, Maura Irby had lived with the memory of her husband's death. She later said the wait for justice felt endless, but after the execution, she described feeling something she hadn't felt in decades: relief. She said it felt like she was finally able to take a deep breath again. However, she also admitted the situation was complicated. She didn't celebrate someone dying. Instead, she said the execution wasn't about revenge. To her, it was about justice. Meanwhile, during his time on death row, Buntion had reportedly found religion. He spent years reading the Bible and speaking about faith. But none of that changed the final outcome. After more than 30 years behind bars, his story ended in the execution chamber. Carl Wayne Buntion's case remains one of the most debated executions in recent Texas history, not because of what he did, but because of when the state carried out the punishment. By the time he was executed, he had spent 32 years on death row. He was elderly, sick, and no longer the man he was in 1990. So the question still lingers: does justice have an expiration date, or should punishment be carried out no matter how much time passes? People still argue about that today. But one thing is certain: the story of Carl Wayne Buntion is a powerful reminder of how complicated justice can be. And if stories like this fascinate you, make sure you like the video and subscribe before you go, because the next case we cover might be even more shocking.